In addition to my role as director of the Wheatley Institution, and which makes me glad every time our keynote speaker shows up, I'm especially glad to have Dr. Anderson with us. I've known Ryan for a number of years, and he's been a friend of the institution. He's been a source of information and of dialogue with us. And just at the beginning, I want you to know, as an audience, that there are very few people that I've ever known who have this remarkable combination. He's an absolutely rigorous, clear thinker. He's a gracious human being and an absolutely charitable Christian. Now, when you put that together, that's not bad, especially in an area which in our culture has come to be rather controversial. It's one of those areas where people often expect to be offended one way or another. And Ryan has been nothing but gracious in every form that I've seen him talk. He's mastered that. And that's an important thing when you're talking about things that are important to us. Ryan T. Anderson is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles and Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation. He's the founder and editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. He's the author of a number of books, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment, and Truth Overruled, the Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. He's the co-author of What is Marriage? Man, Woman, a Defense, and Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination. And also in 2017, the University of Notre Dame Press released a collection of essays he edited with Dan Philpott titled A Liberalism Safe for Catholicism? Perspectives from the Review of Politics. Anderson's research has been cited by two Supreme Court justices, Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, in two Supreme Court cases. He received his Bachelor of Arts from Princeton University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude. He received his doctoral degree in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. His dissertation was titled Neither Liberal Nor Libertarian, a Natural Law Approach to Social Justice and Economic Rights. Ryan has made appearances on ABC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, and Fox News, and there's probably another bunch of letters in there somewhere. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Review of Law and Public Policy, the Harvard Health Policy Review, the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy, the Weekly Standard, the National Review, just to cover all the bases. He's a member of the James Madison Society at Princeton University, a fellow of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, and a visiting fellow at the Veritas Center at Franciscan University. And I know that Ryan has never let any grass grow beneath his feet, and I understand that he's just finished another course of study that has granted him another degree and a title, and that's Dad. So we're happy to have with us Dr. Ryan Anderson.
Great. Thank you, Richard, for that generous introduction. And thank you both to Richard and Emily for the invitation to speak here. I think it was about 5 years ago that I first spoke at BYU, and more or less I've made a visit almost each and every year since then to speak back here. And I always love my trips to BYU, and it reminds me what a privilege it is to kind of work together with all of you to defend things that matter so much. And so with the opportunity of the leadership of BYU here, thank you for the university's witness on these issues. Thank you for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and your witness on these issues. While we don't share a theological home together on all the issues that matter, it's been great to be able to partner together these family issues and on these marital issues. I do want to say one thing in my defense before I get started on tonight's lecture. My body thinks it's about 9:45 p.m. Because I woke up this morning in Washington, D.C., and there's a 2-hour time zone. I normally go to bed around 9 p.m., so I'm already 45 minutes past my bedtime. But as Richard mentioned, there is a 6-month-old at home, so if I fall asleep during my talk, if any of you cry, it'll wake me right back up, and every couple of hours I'm up anyway, so it won't be too much of a problem. What I'm trying to do tonight, what I want to do tonight, what I plan to do tonight, is actually take a step back from some of the specific battles that some of us have been engaged in over the past 5 years or so. Many of us were involved in the discussion over the legal definition of marriage and the Supreme Court's redefinition of marriage. Many of us have been involved in some of the religious liberty discussions that have been taking place since the redefinition of marriage. And it's easy to lose sight of the forest when you're just focusing on one tree or one branch of one tree. And so if you've been engaged in the debate about same-sex marriage or the debate about divorce, debate about single parenthood, you can lose sight of some of the bigger picture. So what I plan on doing is walking through the arc of life twice, starting with conception. I want to walk you through your life, or the life of your friend, the life of your future child, from when you're conceived to when you die. The idea being to show how the family mediates and facilitates all these forms of human flourishing. So that'll be the first time that I walk through it. And the second time I'm going to walk through it, not as the ideal of how things ideally would go, but as the reality. I'm going to walk through what that arc of life actually looks like in the United States today. And I think that'll highlight various ways in which people are failing to flourish, in which we have people who fail to launch in life or people who have setbacks in life, and the ways in which the family could rehabilitate and facilitate flourishing if the family was stronger. So the idea here would be to actually highlight the importance of marriage today by showing the ways in which it's failing with the big picture. All right, so the first walk through the arc of life. I'm going to go through their 4 stages. I'm going to talk about conception and your unborn stage, then childhood, adulthood, and then old age is the 4 kind of stages. So first, if you're conceived, you are conceived. You're conceived inside of the context of a loving bond between your mom and your dad, who are committed to each other and who are committed to you. And you're conceived as the fruit of their love for each other. You're not conceived as a product of technology. You're not conceived as something that's manufactured in a hatchery. You're conceived as the fruit of their spousal love for one another. And therefore, you're welcomed in life. You're viewed as a gift. You're entering into life in a context in which there are people committed to one another. Their commitment to each other led to the outgrowth of your very existence, and they're now committed to your care, welcoming you into life as a gift. And then doing all of those things that conscientious parents do. Right? They're preparing the nursery, they're putting up wallpaper, they're taking prenatal vitamins, they're exercising, all of those things that they can do during those 9 months while you're in utero to welcome you, to prepare you for life. Your father is helping to take care of your mother at this point already. Through the 9 months of pregnancy, through morning sickness, through various cravings. Pregnancy's frequently not a very easy or fun time period, and there's a way in which that burden can be shouldered inside of a family context. And this doesn't just take place within the nuclear family, but your mother and father and their marriage are actually nestled inside of a larger family tree and a larger network. With your grandparents, with your aunts and your uncles. So your mom and dad are being cared for by their extended family and therefore your extended family. And that's how you enter the world those 9 months in utero. 9 months later, after conception, you're born. You're born into that family context with your mother and your father, again, committed to each other and now committed to you, recognizing you as flesh of their flesh and bone of their bone, recognizing you as the embodiment of their love. During some of the discussions of the redefinition of marriage, we would talk about how children are conceived in a conjugal act, or where the two can unite as one flesh, and that's true for the marital act. Husband and wife unite as one flesh in the marital act, but they also unite as one flesh in their children, right? And so this is a perpetuated form of that two and one flesh union. You're now being born into that context where they recognize you as the extenuation of their marital love. And so sure, this will now have all of the practical necessities. There will be diaper changes in the middle of the night. There will be feedings in the middle of the night. This will be love and care and protection and affection for the next 18 years or so of your life inside of their home. And you'll see three things that particularly matter for the social scientists, and I think this also matters from a humanistic perspective. You'll see the importance of biological connections. You're now born into an environment where you have a maternal and a paternal connection, where you're connected to the mother and the father who helped give you life. Which then leads to the second aspect. You'll have now the influence of both masculine and feminine examples and role models and forms of care and love and protection. Your mother will do certain things for you, and your father will do certain things for you. They're not just interchangeable parents. There's really no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and there's fathering. You'll be provided with both. And then you will have the protection that comes with commitment. Because this is formalized inside of marriage, you know that they're going to be caring for each other and caring for you. And then therefore they're going to be modeling something for you that's very important of what a marital relationship looks like. Many of us first learn what marriage is and what it means to be a husband or a wife or mother or a father from our own parents and the example that they set. The next thing that might happen for you, brothers and sisters, siblings, in addition to the gift of life that you've received from your parents, you might receive the gift of siblings, of brothers and sisters, and all of that is nestled inside of a matrix or a web of extended families, of your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, grandparents. And this parental support, this web of love will kind of cocoon you and protect you up through, let's say, graduation, whether from high school or college. At which point, the third step of this arc of life, you're now an adult. You're going to be starting to form your own family. Right? So you've gone through your utero stage, you've gone through your childhood stage, you're now matured, you've been brought along that pathway. And so you've discerned who it is that God wants you to marry. You've courted this person, you've somehow persuaded this person to marry you. You're now forming your own family, where your spouse will now support you through the next step in life. Maybe it's graduate school, maybe it's the first job, maybe it's finishing your undergraduate degree. I have to remember that I'm speaking at BYU, so several of you might already be married as undergraduates. If I was at any other campus, I wouldn't have to say that. And you can see how this marriage isn't a capstone at the conclusion of your life. It's a foundation stone. It's a cornerstone. Right? And so you and your spouse are now going to be providing each other that mutual support, that love, that care, that affection. And then one day you're going to view your own children as the embodiment of your spousal love. You and your spouse will be uniting as one flesh, where the love-making act is also the life-giving act. And as an extenuation of your own marital love will be these gifts of your future children. And then you and your spouse will raise these children together. And you will see kind of your life's work with your spouse, not primarily about getting a job promotion or passing a test or any of those sorts of limited tangible items. But it will be creating and then raising these new human beings. You'll see that your biggest life's work together with your spouse and inside of your family and your marriage will be your parenting, your mothering, your fathering. And of course, this will take place within a larger web of family, because your brothers and sisters have by now also gotten married and had children. So you now have in-laws, you have sisters-in-laws, brothers-in-laws, you now have nieces and nephews. You're now an uncle or you're an aunt. And you can see how all of these relationships, these webs of familial connections keep expanding and multiplying. Actually, they're going to be a form of exponential growth here. And at a certain point, after you've married, you've had your own children, you're going to start caring for your parents as they age. Right? So part of the commandment to honor your mother and father is not just to kind of behave and obey them when you're a child, but as they grow old and as they grow a little infirm, as they become more elderly, to welcome them back into your own home, right? To respect them and to honor them, to cherish them at the end of their lives. And therefore, too, to have them now help you as you raise your children, as they help you raise their grandchildren. Right? All of this goes so much more easily when you have these webs of family connection, when you're not just doing it on your own. And then the fourth step, you got through your unborn stage, your childhood stage, your adulthood stage. Now you're old. You're now entering old age. And what you've left behind is a legacy, your children, your grandchildren. They're welcoming you into their home. You're getting to enjoy all of the fun of being a grandparent without any of the work. All of the enjoyment with none of the responsibility. And they welcome you for your wisdom, for your guidance, for your knowledge. And you feel loved. You feel cherished, even up until the very last day of your life. You don't feel like you're a burden. You feel like you're a dignified, worthy member of meaningful communities. So that's one walk through of the arc of life. And it's what I would describe as an ideal. I think most of us would want our lives to look like that. From the moment we're conceived to the moment that we die, we would want to have those types of familial relationships. We'd want to have those types of support, those types of meaningful connections, and one day a legacy that we leave behind, a family tree that keeps branching off into further and further generations with more and more connections of love. What does it actually look like in the United States? How are we doing on this? And so let's walk through that arc again. If you're a baby conceived today in the United States, you have a 50-50 chance of being conceived inside or outside of marriage. So that's the starting point. About half of all births, or half of all conceptions, are outside of marriage. The next thing to say is that somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000 of those unborn children will be aborted each year. You won't make it to birth. The numbers are disputed because California doesn't report its statistics to the CDC, and so and they're one of the largest, most populous, and unfortunately most performed abortions. And so you have to estimate from the Guttmacher Institute, which is the Planned Parenthood research arm. So it's somewhere between 600 to 900,000 abortions are performed in the U.S. Each year. And 86% of those abortions are from single women. So one of the best protectors for unborn children is marriage. Married women have abortions at the rate of 4%. 4% of their pregnancy. So there are two different ways that the statisticians crunch these numbers. Which percentage of abortions are by single or married women, and then which percentage of pregnancies end in abortions. And so if you're pregnant inside of marriage, let's put it this way, if you're that child and you're conceived inside of marriage, you have a 96% chance of making it out alive. So marriage is one of these things that helps protect these unborn children. So let's assume that you are one of those children who will be conceived outside of marriage. We know there's a much higher rate of abortion. 86% of the abortions that take place are going to be taking place outside of marriage. We also know that the childbearing outside of marriage has substantial risks because those women are being poorly served. They don't have a husband who's committed to them. They frequently don't even have a boyfriend who's committed to them. And so they're going to face the 9 months of pregnancy on their own. which means more likely to drink, more likely to smoke, less likely to exercise, less likely to take prenatal vitamins, a 20% greater likelihood of adverse outcomes for the unborn child. Right? And so one of the best protectors for children is marriage, not just because it protects against abortion, but because it protects those 9 months in utero by helping to facilitate and protect the bodily health and the emotional health and the spiritual health of those mothers carrying the child. There are also some new threats to human life at this stage, and I just want to mention 3 of them. Just 2 months ago now, Chinese scientists announced that they had created the first genetically modified human baby. Experimentation on human embryos to change the genome in the embryo, and this was the first human embryo that was brought to term. So they'd been experimenting on human embryos before, and then they were killing those human beings. This was the first one who was allowed to develop, and actually it was twins. It was 2 children who were allowed to develop and then were born. Now this raises all sorts of bioethical questions about experimentation on minors who don't consent to be research subjects, about human embryo destruction, about the creation of life in the laboratory, about the boundary between enhancement and therapy, and then interventions into the genome that'll be passed on to future generations. If you genetically modify a human embryo, then all of those future children will have that, they will inherit that same genetic modification where the scientists don't know really what they're doing. I just want to focus on 2 of these. I'm going to focus on the embryo destruction and the designer babies, the creating of life in the lab. And the first thing to say is that all of these forms of new assisted reproductive technologies create many more embryos than are ever implanted. Most families don't want to be octomom. You'll remember from several years ago, a woman who gave birth to 8 babies. Most people don't want to be octomom, they just want to have 1 child. But they'll create 16 embryos, they'll freeze 8 of them, they will implant 8 of them, and then the euphemism is selective reduction. They will destroy all but the most promising embryo. And so riddled throughout the assisted reproductive technology field is just an utter disregard for human beings in the earliest stage of our existence. Half of them are still in freezers, almost half of them end up being destroyed just to get that 1 live birth. But what's raising new questions is whether or not we should be creating designer babies, whether or not we should be not viewing children as gifts to be received, not viewing children as something that supervenes upon an act of marital love, but viewing children more as creatures that we can manufacture through technological means. Assisted reproduction is actually a misnomer because this isn't assisting an act of reproduction, it's actually bypassing human procreation. It's viewing this much more as manufacture. It's replacing reproduction. It's replacing procreation with the creation of life in a lab. And so while we should be concerned about the dignity of life in terms of the destruction of life, we should also be concerned about the dignity of life in its very initial moment of creation. How are human beings entering the world? Are they entering the world as gifts that supervene upon marital love, or are they entering the world as products of scientist manipulations in laboratories? Leon Kass, a bioethicist at the University of Chicago, a humanist, he wrote probably a decade ago when he was chairing President Bush's Council on Bioethics, and this is when some of the first debates about cloning were taking place. He said, "As bad as it might be to destroy a creature made in God's image, it might be very much worse to be creating them after images of one's own." And so we now have a new form of concern for how we're going to be welcoming human beings into life. The second thing I want to mention is the commodification of children and the exploitation of women through commercial surrogacy. Just 2 weeks ago, the governor of New York, after going through, you probably saw in the news, New York passed one of the most extreme abortion laws, and then he said the next thing that they would be considering is legalizing commercial surrogacy. Surrogacy was banned back in the 80s when it first started being technically feasible, and they now want to reconsider that. Maybe we should be allowed to rent a woman's womb for 9 months, have a commercial contract to have her carry your child. And when you combine this with the redefinition of marriage, one of the things that we're seeing is that same-sex couples, particularly male couples, who want to have a child of their own, will purchase someone's eggs, will rent someone's womb to create a child who will then be denied a mother. Right? That child will have two fathers, but no mother. And the women who are most likely to agree to commercial surrogacy tend not to be upper middle class, college educated young professionals. Right? They tend to be people on the margins of life who are doing this for economic necessity. And so there's the risk here of exploitation of poor women. Frequently the term here is surrogacy tourism, where people will go overseas, frequently to India, rent a poor woman's womb for 9 months to have their baby. If you're interested not so much in the statistics and the social science, but in the personal stories, there's a fascinating and terrifying report on anonymous sperm donation and children who have been conceived through anonymous sperm donation, titled "My Daddy's Name is Donor," where it tells the story of children who have been conceived through anonymous sperm donation, and how that changes their own understanding of paternity and maternity, and their own self-understanding of where they came from and how they were brought into the world. So that's that first step. What does the actual reality look like for the unborn? With roughly half of all conceptions taking place outside of marriage, where several 100,000 abortions being performed each year, and with a very significant discrepancy, or a very significant difference between what pregnancy inside of marriage and pregnancy outside of marriage looks like, with marriage being one of the most pro-children institutions that we know of. The next step, your childhood. This is where I think most of the social science is best known. What does it look like for children who are born inside of marriage or not? First, just by the numbers, how many are living that ideal? The percentage of U.S. teenagers who will make it to age 16, having been raised by both of their biological parents, is 46%. So the majority of American children will not be raised by their married biological mothers and fathers. So that ideal is not happening for half. What does it look like in terms of single parenting? There are a variety of ways in which you could fall short of that ideal. Right now, 40% of all American children are born to single mothers. It's 50% of Hispanic children, and it's over 70% of African American children. And so these children have done nothing wrong in life, right? They're not at fault here, but they're going to have a harder road in life, precisely because they entered life outside of that protective sphere of marriage. It's not just single parenting, though. Right now, somewhere, depending on how you crunch the numbers, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all marriages end in divorce. And these numbers hit the poor and the working class much more acutely. Upper middle class, college educated people actually get married and stay married at rates that look much more like our parents and our grandparents. So much so that when Charles Murray wrote his book, Coming Apart, he said the way in which we're coming apart is between who gets married and stay married and who doesn't. And the children who are raised inside of those get married and stay married families, and the children of those who don't. And then the third prospect, it could be single parenthood, it could be divorce if you're not being raised inside of that ideal. The third possibility is cohabitation. And right now, about 40% of American children will spend time in a cohabitating household by age 12. So if you combine those single parenthood numbers and those divorce numbers and figure out which percentage of the divorced people will then cohabitate, which percentage of the single mothers will then cohabitate, you end up with 42% of children spending time in a cohabiting household by age 12. Now, what are those outcomes? Let me read you one quote. I think I've read this quote here once before. I'll ask you who said it. We know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Which right-wing nut job said that? Was that Jerry Falwell? Was that Pat Robertson? Was that John Paul II? It was President Obama. It was President Obama before he evolved on marriage. He had given a Father's Day address. He spoke about the importance of fathers then. He then gave a commencement address at Morehouse College, a historically black college, and he was encouraging those graduating seniors to be good fathers. And the reason why is because he knew what it was like firsthand to grow up without a father. And he knows that he beat the odds. That many of his contemporaries, many of other children who entered the world into situations like his didn't beat the odds. He had done well for himself, obviously, regardless of your political views. He's led a flourishing life. He broke a cycle. So he mentions they're 5 times more likely to live in poverty, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in prison. There are economic differences when you look at marital upbringing versus non-marital. There are crime differences, graduation differences. You can go through the list, and I imagine Catherine tomorrow during her presentation will go through some of that social science on just what those difference and outcomes are. I just want to give you one snapshot of this. Look at graduation rates. If you were that child who was conceived inside of marriage, born inside of marriage, raised by your married mom and dad, you have a 91% chance of graduating high school. If your parents divorced, 76% chance. If you were raised by a single parent, always single, 63%. And if you were raised in a cohabiting household, only a 60%. The cohabitation actually has the poorest outcomes because you don't have that commitment. The reason I had stressed the commitment in the first part was that it's not just 2 incomes, it's not just a father figure and a mother figure, it's both the biological connection, it's both the mother and the father, and it's the commitment. All 3 of those things tend to produce the better outcomes. This then perpetuates itself. As President Obama mentioned when he said they're more likely to become single mothers, I think he might have said single parents themselves, what we see is that girls whose parents divorce are more likely to be divorced later on in their own lives. Their marriages are more likely to fall apart prematurely. But those stats don't measure everything. Those stats can give you kind of some of the empirical outcomes. They don't capture the rich texture of life. They don't capture what you would be missing out on if you never have a meaningful relationship with your father. It's not just that you have a lower percentage likelihood of graduating from high school or being employed or a greater likelihood of experiencing poverty or spending time in jail. Although all of those things matter, it's also that you've missed out on all of those afternoons in the backyard tossing around a football. Or you've missed out on knowing your grandparents on your father's side of the family tree. Or you've missed out on knowing your aunts and your uncles on that father's side of the tree. The social science can capture kind of discrete snapshots on particular metrics. What they don't capture is that rich texture of life. Right? And one of those things that we now know is that you're going to be missing out on siblings. The chances are if you were born today, you would have less than 1 sibling. You would have 0.9 sibling if you were in the average household for 2018. 1.9 is what the average number of children of biologically born conceived children in the U.S. The only reason we have an above replacement level population is because of immigration. And in fact, right now, only 2 states in the United States have above replacement level population from American-born children. I think Utah's one, and I forget the other one. So you can congratulate yourselves on being one of those two. So what does this mean if you're statistically likely to have 0.9 siblings? It's mean you're going to have fewer aunts and uncles as these perpetuate themselves. If you only have 0.9 siblings, and then your children, you only have 1.9 children, there are going to be fewer aunts and uncles, fewer cousins, fewer nieces and nephews. George Weigel has pointed out in one of his books that in some Western European countries, where their reproduction numbers have fallen below 1.5, they don't have firsthand experience of what it is to be a brother or a sister, an aunt or an uncle, a niece or a nephew or a cousin. Because if you had 2 generations of single children, you don't have a brother or a sister. You aren't a brother or a sister. And your parents didn't have any brothers or sisters, which means you don't have an aunt or an uncle, which means you can't have cousins, which means if you only have one child, they won't have nieces and nephews. And so you can see that that entire rich texture of life that I described in the first part is rapidly disappearing for many people. Not yet in America, we're not quite that low, but in some Western European countries, they don't have any firsthand experiential knowledge. They have intellectual knowledge. They've heard about these things known as aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters. They just never actually experienced it for themselves. If you want more on kind of like the first person story on what this looks like, there's a wonderful report that Elizabeth Marquardt wrote maybe a decade ago titled Between Two Worlds, The Inner Lives of Children of Divorce, that just looks at what the kind of narrative looks like. Leon Cass, he wrote an essay on courtship maybe 15 years ago now, and what he reflected on, he says, quote, "Countless students at the University of Chicago have told my wife and me that the divorce of their parents has been the most devastating and life-shaping events of their lives. They are conscious of the fact that they enter into relationships guardedly and tentatively. For good reason, they believe that they must always be looking out for number one." So what Professor Cass was reflecting on was how your parents' divorce will then radically change how you view your own dating relationships, your own future spousal relationships, not from the perspective of a number-crunching social scientist, but just from the testimony of his own students. And he's at the University of Chicago, not a particularly religious school, not a particularly conservative school. It's a rather secular, left-leaning institution. And this is the testimony of his secular, left-leaning students. So that's that second step of the arc of life, your childhood. What about your own adulthood, your own parenthood? The essay that I've been quoting Professor Cass from, it's something I just taught at a course that I'm teaching at Christendom College, where he wrote a piece called The End of Courtship. And what he says is that we have no institutions left in the United States besides religious institutions, and so here at BYU, you're the exception. No institutions left in the United States that help people get married and stay married. We don't have any sort of social scripts, any sorts of norms, any sort of common expectations of what it looks like to find your life partner, to find your spouse. And Cass actually criticizes some people like me. He would say, they've spent lots of time discussing the public policy of marriage. And then he says, quote, "Very little attention is being paid to what makes for marital success." He continues, "Today there are no socially prescribed forms of conduct that help guide young men and women in the direction of matrimony." And this was the testimony of his students at Chicago. They would say, yeah, one day we want to get married, but we have no idea how. Because we don't have courtship anymore. This is why his essay was titled The End of Courtship. What we have is hookup culture. What we have is cohabitation. What we have is friends with benefits, none of which actually prepare someone for marriage. And what Cass describes here is that the reason he and his wife started teaching a courtship course at the University of Chicago was that he felt that his students were missing out on one of the most important and life-enriching experiences possible, They were missing out on family life. They were missing out on marriage. No one was helping these students actually attain what would make them most happy in life, right? Not just getting a college degree, not just getting a high-paying job. We have lots of institutions that are devoted to those goals. No one was helping them understand what marriage is, why marriage matters, how to discern who your spouse should be, how to capture the heart of your spouse, and how to then maintain their heart, how to maintain that relationship. Instead, what we have is cohabitation, which isn't trial marriage. I think too many people seem to think that cohabitation is a step towards marriage. Cass writes, marriage is not something one tries on for size and then decides whether to keep. It is rather something one decides with a promise and then bends every effort to keep. And so the CDC numbers here show that people who have lived together before marrying have a 50% higher likelihood of divorce than those who don't. Cohabitation increases your odds for divorce. And the CDC study points out that only 40% of cohabiting couples go on to get married. Right? So many people think that by moving in with their boyfriend, they're going to get him to finally settle down and commit. The majority of the time, he's not. And then even when he does, about 50% of the time, you're going to be divorced within 5 years. Right? Why would anyone like those odds? As a whole, for this younger generation, I guess I'm part of this younger generation, fewer people are getting married. They're getting married later in life. Around 40% of those marriages are ending in divorce, and they're having fewer children. So for this third stage in the arc of life, adulthood, where you're now setting out, forming your own families, many people are going to fail to flourish in family life, in kind of domestic life, in the things that frequently bring the deepest satisfaction from the perspective of your deathbed. When you're looking back on your life, what is it that you're going to kind of cherish the most? It's not going to be the number of billable hours that you put in at the office. And it's not going to be the GPA that you achieved at school. It's going to be the life that you built with your spouse, the children that you raised in those networks. And fewer people are getting married. They get married later in life, increased risk for divorce, and then fewer kids. The CDC says we're actually now at a 30-year low for our fertility rates. And again, only 2 states have replacement level fertility. And so this family matrix matters for adults just as much as it does for children. So I read you all the stats about how marriage helps protect children. It also helps protect adults. So let me tell you all of the things that I've benefited from. The last time I was here, I was single. I'm now married. I'm going to commit less crime. I'm going to spend less time in bars and in jails. I will make more money. I will have better and more sex. I will have better physical and mental health. I will live longer, and I will have greater happiness. According to all of the social science, and Catherine, this is a guarantee, right? All those things will happen. I don't think that's actually how social science works. But on average, and for the most part, men who are married will commit less crime. They will spend less time in jail and in bars. They will make more money. They will have better and more sex. They will have better physical and mental health. They will live longer, and they will report greater happiness. Women, the statistics look a little bit different. They won't, let me rephrase this. They will make more money until they start having kids, but then they will make less money because they will actually choose to spend more time with children. The average American woman with children doesn't want to be working full-time, doesn't want to be at home full-time. They want to have some flex time where they spend some time at home and some time in the paid labor force. And so as a result, when you look at the aggregate statistics, they will say there's a marriage penalty, women make less money after being married. Well, no, they're finding other forms of fulfillment besides monetary fulfillment. Their wages do go up while they're still childless, but then they actually redirect some of that energy towards domestic life, towards family life, and they find it makes them very fulfilled. Let me read you a couple other quotes from a CDC report. Wives are less likely to commit suicide than single, divorced, or widowed women. Wives are almost twice as likely as divorced or never, or hold up, let me make sure I get this right. Wives, for example, are almost twice as likely as divorced or never married women to have a sex life that A, exists, and B, is extremely satisfying emotionally. They're also less likely to be the victim of violence. Found that single and divorced women were 4 to 5 times more likely to be the victims of physical violence in any given year than married women. Right? And frequently, they're victimized by non-husband live-in boyfriends. Right? One of the most dangerous places would be that cohabitating relationship. What does this now look like taken as a whole for this third stage is that we now see for the third consecutive year, and this is the first time in American history, and yet it's now for the third consecutive year, U.S. life expectancy has dropped. Right? We're a developed Western nation where life expectancy should be going up and going up and going up, and now for 3 consecutive years it's actually dropped. Many of these are what's known as deaths of despair, suicides, opioid overdoses. We have a loneliness epidemic for 20s and 30-somethings, young men who feel like they have no future and no hope. This is one of those things that marriage and family best protect against. Right? If you have meaningful relationships, meaningful familial relationships. And then all of this only gets worse as you age. So to round out this arc of life, what does this loneliness epidemic look like when you're in your 70s and your 80s or your 90s, and you're either never married or you're divorced, when you didn't have any children, or where your children are estranged from you because you kind of abandoned them and you never were there for them? Let me read you two quotes. Compared to the birth cohort of 1930, so people who today would be 90 years old, boomers, the baby boomers, will enter retirement with lower rates of living with a spouse, 12% lower, fewer children, 36% lower, fewer close friends, 30% lower, and fewer community ties, 40% lower. So if you want to compare, for many of you, this would be your great-grandparents to your grandparents, 12% less likely to be married, 36% fewer children, 30% fewer friends, and 40% fewer close family ties. This is kind of the intergenerational consequence of bowling alone, if you're familiar with Robert Putnam's work on kind of the decline of social capital. By 2060, over 21 million Americans over the age of 50 will be living without a partner or child, up from 15 million in 2015. These kinless Americans will outnumber those expected to have Alzheimer's, which will be 13.8 million, diabetes, 16 million, or arthritis. So if you think about the kind of standard diseases that you expect to see in old age, Alzheimer's, diabetes, arthritis, there will be more Americans living without spouse or child than facing all of these other forms of physical decline. What will this look like? Right? We're going to be seeing here what happens at the end of life when marriages either fail to form or fall apart prematurely. And this is something that we haven't really experienced in the United States. We've now been living through for the past 40 years what happens for children. Back when Moynihan wrote his famous report, births to single mothers were in the single digits. Moynihan wrote his report in 1964. Births to single mothers in 64 were about 4 to 5%. And today it's 40% of all Americans born to single mothers. But what now happens at the tail end of life? The social scientists have been focusing on the children conceived and raised outside of marriage. Now we're going to be looking at the grandparents who don't actually have children or grandchildren. They're just elderly. What's going to happen to the elderly who are divorced? What's going to happen when you have those family estrangements? And I think this is one of the reasons why we now see the renewed push for physician-assisted suicide. This isn't just happenstance. We live in the most medically advanced era of any point in human history. We have the best hospice care, the best palliative care, the best pain management, the best medicine money can buy. And it's only now that we think we have to kill our elderly in order to provide a death with dignity. Right? For 2.5 millennia, we've abided by the Hippocratic Oath that doctors shouldn't kill their patients or suggest to their patients that they kill themselves. And it's only now, with the best medical technologies possible to treat pain and to minimize discomfort, that we think that doctors have to violate the Hippocratic Oath. And I think this has much less to do with medicine than it has to do with community, than it has to do with whether or not we want to shoulder one another's burdens, and whether or not we have those networks capable of shouldering those burdens. Whether or not you as students right now are thinking with your siblings what 10 or 20 years from now it will look like as your own parents age. And will you be welcoming them into your home? Will you be caring for them? Or will you aspire to so much independence for yourselves at the cost of your parents feeling like they're a burden? Right? How will the arc of life where we enter life entirely dependent on other people, and when we exit life entirely dependent on other people, will those dependencies be honored and cherished and actually be viewed as a form in which human community flourishes, right? Where we meet each other's needs, where we help shoulder those burdens? Or will it be viewed as a form of independence is what matters most, and therefore we're each on our own? Because increasingly that's what it's looking like. At the beginning of life, at the end of life, and in between, there aren't those ties that bind us. They're not standing the test of time. So with that, let me just close, because we've now walked through the arc twice. And the second time you walk through it, it's much more depressing than the first, because it highlights all of those challenges, right? Every one of those statistics, behind every one of those statistics are real people, right? Real families, real human suffering. And the common thread behind all of those real human people, real human either suffering or flourishing, is how strong families, stable families, even an understanding of what marriage and family is, and then the ability to form people to enter into and to live out their marital vows, it can combat this, right? It can respond to this. It can prevent many of these forms of failing to flourish, right? Failures to launch in life, ways in which we suffer. And it can actually provide kind of a haven in an otherwise unlovely world. And so that's the great thing about this conference, this roundtable that you'll be engaged in tomorrow, the work that you're doing as students who want to be defending marriage and the family. You're actually engaged on probably the most important project that you could commit your lives to.